Hello. It's going to be a little bit different this time, only because a young woman was clearing out her aunt's apartment and came to my door and said she didn't have any use for her aunt's old candlesticks. She wanted to know if I would have them. So I took them from her. Then it reminded me that this was the time of the year that the fifth grade would do artifacts, and I would read Mrs. Moskowitz and the Sabbath Candlesticks, which is a similar type of story. And it was also brought about because when my grandmother came from Europe, what she brought with her were her candlesticks. So, the neighbor brought me them looking like this, and with a little polish and elbow grease, they actually end up looking like this. Other things that'll be in this story I happen to have here. There's a little tin recipe box from my mom, so I have her little tin, a fresh challah, and some flowers. These are all part of the story. So let's begin. Mrs. Moskowitz and the Sabbath Candlesticks by Amy Schwartz. The moving man set down the last box in Mrs. Moskowitz's new apartment and wiped his brow. "That's it, ma'am," he said. "Enjoy your new home." Mrs. Moskowitz let her cat out of his box. "You call this a home, Fred?" She walked through the kitchen and the bedroom and back to the living room. "I miss my old house," she said as she sat down. "I miss the flowers in the front. I miss the porch in the back. I miss the old bathtub where I used to watch Sophie and Sam when they were small. This apartment will never, ever be my home." When Mrs. Moskowitz's son came by that evening, the boxes were still not unpacked. Sam kissed his mother and handed her a package. "I found this in the basement when I was locking up the old house, Mother. You must have forgotten it." Mrs. Moskowitz shook the box. Then she opened the lid and took out a sack of soft white cloth. She untied the sack and pulled out 2 tarnished candlesticks. "My Sabbath candlesticks. When you were little, Sam, I polished these until you can see yourself in the reflection. For Shabbat, I cleaned the whole house till it sparkled. Sam, remember how good the freshly baked challah smelled? Remember the laughing and singing after supper? Remember how happy we were?" "Yes," Sam said, "I remember." Mrs. Moskowitz shook her head. "What memories, Sam? What memories?" The next morning, when Mrs. Moskowitz pulled back the curtains, a ray of sunlight struck the candlesticks. "Look at that, Fred. Aren't they lovely?" When Mrs. Moskowitz did her marketing, she dropped a jar of silver polish in it. After lunch, Mrs. Moskowitz polished the candlesticks. She held Fred up to them. "Can you see yourself, Fred?" Then she frowned. "It's the table, Fred. How can my beautiful candlesticks stand on such a plain table?" Mrs. Moskowitz climbed about the many boxes piled on the floor. She tugged at the top flap of the biggest box till it sprang open. She pulled out a dozen sheets, a blue blanket, and a fluffy comforter with feathers coming out at the seams, but she didn't find what she was looking for. "Oh, Fred, where could it be?" Mrs. Moskowitz muttered as she tucked the comforter onto the bed. She rummaged in the box again. It's here somewhere. Here it is! Mrs. Moskowitz pulled out a white tablecloth with silver threads dancing around the border. She shook out the tablecloth and laid it on the table. Fred, come look! It's magnificent. Mrs. Moskowitz stood back and looked too. But Fred, she said, how can such beautiful candlesticks on such a lovely table stand on such a filthy floor? Where did I put my mop? Mrs. Moskowitz unpacked one box after another and finally found a bucket and mop. She scrubbed and mopped the living room floor, the bedroom floor, and then she cleaned her kitchen. She washed the cabinets. She pushed the furniture into place. Mrs. Moskowitz rubbed her back. What those candlesticks are putting me through, she groaned. Then she yawned and turned out the light. In the morning, Mrs. Moskowitz got up early. She watched the light playing on the candlesticks and she brushed her hair. What this table needs is a bunch of flowers. Don't you think, Fred? Mrs. Moskowitz put on her hat and coat and walked to the corner. She went into the flower shop and bought a bunch of posies and a bunch of daisies. On her way home, Mrs. Moskowitz stopped at the grocery store. She bought flour, eggs, yeast, and a box of long white candles. At another store, she bought a tall bottle of red wine. When she got home, Mrs. Moskowitz unpacked her groceries. A table with Shabbat candlesticks, a tablecloth, and lovely flowers. It's still missing one thing, she said. Mrs. Moskowitz found her old tin recipe box and pulled out a worn card. Freshly baked challah. That's what we need. Mrs. Moskowitz sifted and stirred and kneaded the dough. Then she rolled it into 3 long rolls and braided them together. As she worked, Mrs. Moskowitz thought about baking challah with her mother many years ago. She thought about raising her family in the old house. And she thought about the years that were still to come. Mrs. Moskowitz put the 2 loaves of challah in a shallow blue dish and put them aside to rise. Then she wiped her hands on her apron. Just one more thing, Fred. She went to the phone and called her son. Come over tonight, Sam, and bring your family. We'll light the candles and have a Sabbath meal. I'll call Sophie and invite her too. Then Mrs. Moskowitz lay down for a nap. Just before sundown, Sam and his family and Sophie arrived at the door. Shabbat Shalom, Sabbath peace, Sam said as he walked in. Why, Mother, just look at this apartment. Mrs. Moskowitz picked up Fred. She looked around her. The boxes were all unpacked. Everything was clean and in place. The candlesticks stood shining on the table. The apartment looked beautiful. And here was her family to celebrate Shabbat. Mrs. Moskowitz laughed. Fred, when did all this happen? And then she turned to her family. Shabbat Shalom, she said, and welcome to my home. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening. Shabbat Shalom.